The desert sun hung like a brass coin in the Arizona sky, bearing down on Josiah Stone's ranch with the kind of heat that made the air shimmer like water that wasn't there. At 35, Stone had learned to read the land like scripture, every shadow and bird call, carrying meaning that could spell the difference between life and death in this unforgiving country. He was working on the fence line near his well when he first noticed something wrong with the morning. The buzzards weren't circling right. They swept in low, confused arcs near his property line landing and taking off again as if something kept disturbing their grim business. Stone set down his hammer and wiped the sweat from his eyes, squinting against the glare. That's when he saw her. The small figure moved through the sagebrush like a wounded animal weaving an unsteady path toward his well. Even from 50 yards out, Stone could see this was a child, couldn't be more than 7 or 8 years old. The traditional Apache dress hung in tatters from her thin frame, and each step seemed to cost her more effort than the last. Stone's hand moved instinctively to the Colt at his hip. It was 1882, and finding an Apache child on your property usually meant one of two things. Either a raiding party was using her as bait, or something had gone terribly wrong somewhere else. Neither option boded well for a solitary rancher 20 miles from the nearest town, but as the child stumbled closer, Stone could see the truth written in every labored movement. This was no trap. This was starvation. The girl's face had taken on that hollow look he'd seen during the drought of '78, when cattle dropped dead in their tracks, and strong men went mad from thirst. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and her dark eyes had sunk deep into their sockets. Most men in the territory would have reached for their rifles. The Apache wars had left scars on both sides that ran deeper than the canyons cutting through the desert. Just last month, the Williamson Ranch had been burned to the ground, though nobody could prove which side had done it. Fear and hatred had become as much a part of the landscape as the Joshua trees and rattlesnakes. But Josiah Stone had never been like most men. Maybe it was the memory of his own boy dead these 3 years from scarlet fever. Maybe it was the photo of his wife Mary that he still kept by his bedside, though she'd been in the ground nearly as long. Or maybe it was just that seeing a child suffer did something to a man's soul that all the fear in the world couldn't overcome. The girl had reached the well now, her small hands grasping desperately at the stone rim. She tried to reach the rope that held the bucket, but her strength failed her. She sank to her knees in the dust, making sounds that might have been words in Apache, though Stone couldn't understand them. He holstered his pistol and walked toward her, slowly keeping his hands visible and his movements deliberate. No sudden gestures that might startle her into running. As he drew closer, he could see things that made his heart clench tight in his chest. The bones showing through her skin, the way her breath came in short, painful gasps, the fever-bright shine in her eyes that spoke of days without water. "Easy there, little one," Stone said softly, though he knew she couldn't understand his words. "Easy now, I'm not going to hurt you." The girl looked up at him with eyes that held equal measures of fear and desperate hope. She gestured weakly toward the well, then toward her mouth, the universal language of thirst. Stone didn't hesitate. He pulled up the bucket fresh and cold from deep in the earth and knelt beside her. She grabbed at it with shaking hands, but he held it steady, letting her drink slowly. Too much too fast would make her sick, maybe kill her. He'd seen it happen to men lost in the desert. She drank like someone drowning in reverse, each swallow an act of resurrection. Water ran down her chin, soaking into the dusty ground. When the bucket was half empty, Stone gently pulled it away, despite her whimpered protest. "More in a minute," he said, still keeping his voice soft and steady. "Let that settle first." That's when he noticed the necklace. Partially hidden beneath her torn dress was a string of beads, Unlike anything he'd seen on the reservation Apaches, the pattern was intricate ceremonial worked with a level of craftsmanship that spoke of importance, of rank. The blue and white beads caught the sunlight, and Stone felt his mouth go dry despite the water nearby. Old Tom Hutchins had described beads exactly like these just last week at the general store. They were the mark of Chief Red Thunder's family, worn only by his children and his wives. And Red Thunder was no reservation Indian. He led one of the last free bands of Apache, still fighting the encroachment of white settlers with a ferocity that had made him a legend on both sides of the conflict. Stone's mind raced through the implications. If this girl was who he thought she was, then helping her could bring the wrath of the entire Apache nation down on his head. Or worse, it could bring the cavalry who might not stop to ask questions about why he was harboring the daughter of their most wanted enemy. But the girl was reaching for the water again, her thin body trembling with need, and Stone found he couldn't turn away. Whatever came next, he wouldn't let a child die of thirst on his land, not when he had water to give. He scooped her up gently. She weighed almost nothing, like a bird made of hollow bones and air, and carried her toward his cabin. She didn't resist, too weak to fight, even if she'd wanted to. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he could feel the fever heat radiating from her small body. Inside the cabin, Stone set her carefully in his only good chair, the one Mary had brought from St. Louis when they'd first married. He moved quickly to the stove where last night's stew still simmered. The smell of beef and beans filled the small space, and the girl's eyes tracked his movements with an intensity that spoke of days without food. He ladled a small portion into a bowl, tore off a chunk of the bread he'd baked that morning. The girl reached for the food with shaking hands, and Stone had to steady the bowl as she ate. She wolfed down the stew like a starving wolf, barely pausing to chew. When the bowl was empty, she looked up at him with something that might have been gratitude breaking through the fear in her eyes. Stone gave her more water, then more food, watching carefully for signs that her shrunken stomach might rebel. But she kept it all down, and gradually the trembling in her limbs began to ease. Color returned to her cheeks, and her breathing grew less labored. As she ate, Stone found himself studying her face. Beneath the dirt and exhaustion, she had the fine features he'd noticed in other Apache children during his few peaceful encounters with their people. High cheekbones, intelligent eyes, a stubborn set to her jaw that reminded him painfully of his own son's determination. The afternoon shadows were beginning to lengthen across the cabin floor when exhaustion finally overtook her. Her eyelids drooped, and the empty bowl slipped from her fingers. Stone caught it before it could clatter to the floor, then fetched his only blanket, a wedding gift from Mary's mother, and tucked it around the sleeping child. He stood there for a long moment, watching her sleep in his chair, and wondered what, in God's name, he'd just done. Outside, the desert was silent except for the whisper of wind through the sage, but Stone had lived here long enough to know that silence could be deceptive. Somewhere out there, people were looking for this girl. Whether they were Apache warriors or cavalry soldiers, they would come here eventually. And when they did, Josiah Stone would have to answer for the choice he'd made today. The choice to see a dying child instead of an enemy. The choice to offer water instead of bullets. The choice that might cost him everything, but that he already knew he wouldn't take back even if he could. The pounding of hoofbeats on the hard-packed road jolted Stone from his contemplation. Through the window he could see 3 riders approaching, fast dust billowing behind them like smoke from a prairie fire. Even before they reached his gate, Stone recognized the lead rider's distinctive slouch in the saddle. Ezra Blackwood, his nearest neighbor, and a man who'd never met a grudge he couldn't nurse into something bigger. Stone stepped outside before they could dismount, hoping to keep their voices down and avoid waking the girl. But Blackwood was already shouting before his horse came to a complete stop. "Stone, you goddamned fool!" Blackwood's face was red as a sunset, Whether from the ride or anger, Stone couldn't tell. "What in the seven hells are you thinking?" The other two riders Stone recognized as Deputy Marshal Sam Hutchins, Old Tom's boy, and Reverend Josiah Mills from the settlement. Both men looked grim as undertakers at a plague town. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Stone said calmly, though his heart was hammering. "Something I can help you with." "Don't play dumb with us," Blackwood spat. "Hutchins here saw smoke signals from the hills not 2 hours ago. The Apache are looking for something, or someone." Deputy Hutchins nodded, his young face serious beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "My father sent word from town, Josiah. Chief Red Thunder's daughter went missing 4 days ago during a hunting expedition. Got separated in that dust storm that blew through. They say she's just a child, maybe 7 or 8 years old." The deputy's eyes searched Stone's face carefully. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about a missing Apache girl, would you?" Stone felt his throat go tight as rawhide in the sun. The smart thing would be to lie to send them away and figure this out on his own. But these men had been his neighbors for years, and despite their faults, they deserved the truth, or at least part of it. "She's inside," Stone said quietly, "half-starved and burning with fever. I couldn't just leave her to die." The silence that followed was heavy as a gravestone. Reverend Mills was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Josiah, do you have any idea what you've done?" "I gave water to a thirsty child," Stone replied. "Fed a hungry one. Last I checked, that's what the good book tells us to do." "The good book wasn't written in Apache territory," Blackwood snarled. He dismounted and began pacing back and forth like a caged cougar. "They're going to think you took her. Hell, they probably already think that. Red Thunder's been known to wipe out entire settlements for less than this." "He's right," Deputy Hutchins said, though he looked uncomfortable saying it. "I've got to report this, Josiah. It's my duty. But I'll give you a head start if you want to try to get her back to her people before—" "Before what?" Stone asked. "Before they find me here in the dark. She can barely walk, Sam. And how am I supposed to approach an Apache camp without getting shot full of arrows?" "That's your problem now," Hutchins said, already backing toward his horse. "I'm riding to town to warn folks. If Red Thunder decides to make an example of you, he might not stop at just your ranch." Reverend Mills dismounted and approached Stone, laying a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Josiah, I understand the impulse. Truly I do. But sometimes mercy can be its own kind of cruelty. What if by saving her life today, you've doomed dozens of others tomorrow? And what if by letting her die, I'd have doomed my own soul?" Stone shot back. "You're a man of God, Reverend. Tell me what Christ would have done." Mills had no answer for that. The 3 men mounted their horses and rode away, leaving Stone alone with the weight of his decision. As their dust settled, he became aware of a new sound carrying across the desert evening. Distant but unmistakable, war drums. The rhythm was slow, methodical, speaking a language older than words. This wasn't the chaotic noise of a raiding party. This was something far more organized and infinitely more dangerous. They weren't waiting for morning. The Apache were coming tonight. Stone rushed back into the cabin. The girl was awake, sitting up in the chair with wide, frightened eyes. The sound of the drums had reached her too, and she clearly understood what they meant better than he did. She spoke rapidly in Apache, pointing toward the door and then at herself. Even without understanding the words, Stone could see the panic in her movements. She was trying to tell him something important, but the language barrier made communication impossible. "I know you can't understand me, little one," Stone said as calmly as he could manage. "But I'm trying to help you. Those drums, that's your people coming for you, isn't it?" The girl nodded vigorously, then grabbed Stone's shirt and pulled him toward the window. She pointed outside and held up both hands, opening and closing her fingers repeatedly. Stone counted along with her movements. 10, 20, 30. She kept going until she'd reached what looked like 200. Stone's legs went weak. 200 warriors. He'd been hoping for maybe a dozen angry braves that he could somehow reason with, but 200. That was enough to level every ranch for 50 miles. The drums stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. Stone moved to the window and peered out into the gathering darkness. At first, he saw nothing. Then, like ghosts materializing from the desert itself, he began to make out shapes moving across his property. They came in perfect formation, warriors on horseback, spreading out in a wide semicircle that was slowly tightening around his cabin. Even in the twilight, Stone could see the war paint on their faces, the feathers in their hair, the weapons in their hands. These weren't men who had come to negotiate. The girl tugged on Stone's sleeve again this time, gesturing toward herself, and then toward the door. She wanted to go to them, but Stone couldn't tell if that would help or make everything worse. What if they thought he'd hurt her? What if they didn't believe she'd come to him willingly? A single voice called out from the darkness, speaking in English with a heavy accent, but perfect clarity. "White man, we know you have taken something that belongs to us. Send out the girl, and perhaps you will live to see morning." Stone's mouth went dry as dust. The voice carried absolute authority. This had to be Chief Red Thunder himself. Stone had heard stories about the man, how he'd united several bands under his leadership, how he'd never lost a battle against the cavalry, how his very name could empty a town faster than news of a plague. Stone stepped toward the door, but the girl grabbed his arm with surprising strength for someone so small. She shook her head frantically and pointed to herself, then made a gesture across her throat. She was trying to warn him about something, but what then understanding struck him like lightning. The girl wasn't just the chief's daughter, she was his only daughter. In Apache culture, that made her invaluable, not just as family but as the future of the bloodline. If anything had happened to her while in Stone's care, even if it wasn't his fault, Red Thunder would have no choice but to make an example of him that other settlers would never forget. Stone realized with growing horror that saving the girl's life might have been the easy part. Now he had to prove to 200 armed warriors that he'd saved her, not stolen her, and he had about 30 seconds to figure out how to do that before Chief Red Thunder lost his patience and turned Stone's ranch into a battlefield. He made his decision, taking a deep breath that might be one of his last. Stone opened the cabin door and stepped outside, with his hands raised high. The girl followed close behind him, pressing against his legs like a frightened colt. The sight that greeted him was something out of his darkest nightmares. 200 Apache warriors sat motionless on their horses, forming a perfect circle around his property. War paint gleamed in the moonlight, and every weapon was pointed directly at him. The very air seemed to crackle with barely contained violence. At the front of the formation sat a man who could only be Chief Red Thunder. He was massive, imposing, with silver streaking through his long black hair and eyes that seemed to burn with barely contained fury. Even from 20 yards away, Stone could feel the force of his presence, like standing too close to a wildfire. The girl called out in Apache and ran toward her father. But instead of the joyful reunion Stone expected, Red Thunder's expression grew even darker. The chief dismounted and knelt beside his daughter, examining her carefully while she spoke rapidly, gesturing back toward Stone and the cabin. Stone couldn't understand the words, but he could read the chief's body language. Every muscle in Red Thunder's frame was coiled like a spring ready to explode into violence. Whatever the girl was telling him, it wasn't making things better. Finally, Red Thunder stood and walked toward Stone with slow, deliberate steps. The other warriors remained mounted but shifted their weapons, the subtle movement creating a sound like 1,000 rattlesnakes preparing to strike. Stone had never felt more alone in his life. My daughter tells me you fed her. Red Thunder said, his English precise and cold as winter frost. She tells me you gave her shelter. He stopped just outside arm's reach, close enough that Stone could see the intricate scars on the chief's chest, marks of countless battles won and enemies defeated. Tell me, white man, why should I believe this? Because it's the truth. Stone replied, his voice steadier than he felt. She was starving. I couldn't let a child die. Red Thunder studied him for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to peer into Stone's very soul. She also tells me you saw the sacred beads of our family around her neck. You knew who she was, yet you did not immediately return her to us. Why? Stone's heart sank. This was the question he'd been dreading. I was going to bring her back in the morning. She was too weak to travel in the darkness. I feared the journey might kill her. Perhaps, Red Thunder said, his voice dropping even lower. Or perhaps you thought to keep her as a prize, to trade her back to us for cattle or horses or safe passage through our lands. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Stone could feel the weight of 200 pairs of eyes on him, warriors waiting for their chief's signal to turn this conversation into a massacre. That's not true, Stone said, meeting Red Thunder's gaze directly. I never wanted anything from you. I just couldn't watch a child suffer. One of the warriors suddenly dismounted and strode forward, his scarred face twisted with rage. Stone recognized the type, a man who'd lost too much and blamed everyone who looked like the ones who'd taken it. The warrior spoke rapidly in Apache, his voice rising with each word, and Stone didn't need a translation to understand the challenge being thrown down. Red Thunder responded quietly but firmly, and Stone watched as the two men faced off, chief against warrior authority, against grief-fueled anger. The girl, Mourning Dove, as Stone had come to think of her, pressed closer to his side, and he could feel her trembling. Other warriors began choosing sides, some moving their horses behind the angry warrior, others remaining loyal to their chief. The careful discipline that had marked their arrival was starting to fracture, and Stone realized he was witnessing something that could split the tribe apart. The scarred warrior, Swift Eagle Red Thunder called him, pointed his lance at Stone and shouted something that made several warriors nod in agreement. Red Thunder's jaw tightened, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the unmistakable tone of a final warning. But Swift Eagle wasn't backing down. He took another step forward, close enough now that the point of his lance was almost touching Red Thunder's chest. The challenge was clear: follow the old ways of blood for blood, or be seen as weak by the younger warriors. That's when Mourning Dove did something that no one expected. She stepped between the two men and began speaking in rapid, passionate Apache. Her young voice cut through the tension like a sharp blade, and Stone watched as Swift Eagle's expression shifted from rage to confusion to something that might have been shame. Red Thunder translated quietly, his own surprise evident. She is telling them exactly what happened, how she got lost in the storm, how she wandered for days without food or water, how she expected to die alone on the desert until you found her. Mourning Dove continued speaking, her voice growing stronger with each word. She pointed to Stone, then to herself, then mimed eating and sleeping. She was telling the story of her rescue, and even the warriors who had been supporting Swift Eagle were listening intently. Now she is telling them about your family photograph. Red Thunder continued, and Stone felt his chest tighten. About how she could see the sadness in your eyes when you looked at it. She is saying that you helped her because you understood loss, not because you wanted to hurt our people. Swift Eagle lowered his lance slightly, but his face still showed doubt. He spoke again, this time directly to Mourning Dove, and Stone caught one word he recognized: Inda, the Apache term for white man, and not a friendly one. Mourning Dove's response was immediate and fierce. She stepped closer to Swift Eagle and spoke with such intensity that several warriors actually moved their horses back. Whatever she was saying, it was having a profound impact. She is asking him if he has children. Red Thunder translated surprise evident in his voice. She is asking him what he would want a stranger to do if his child was dying of thirst in the wilderness. Swift Eagle's lance dropped to his side completely. The girl wasn't finished. She continued speaking her words, now directed at all the warriors around them. Stone could see the effect rippling through the crowd as hard faces began to soften, weapons lowering slightly. She is telling them that judging you for your kindness would make us no better than the soldiers who kill without asking questions first. Red Thunder's voice had taken on a note of wonder. She is saying that if we punish mercy, we become the monsters that the white man believes us to be. The silence that followed was absolute. 200 warriors sat motionless, processing the words of a 7-year-old girl who had just challenged their deepest beliefs about justice and revenge. Finally, Swift Eagle spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Red Thunder's translation came slowly. He says that perhaps the spirit sent his brother a teacher instead of an enemy. He says that maybe wisdom sometimes comes from the smallest voices. Stone felt something shift in the air around them. The tension wasn't gone, but it had transformed into something else. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. Red Thunder looked at Stone with something that might have been respect. My daughter has just done something remarkable. She has turned a war party into a council meeting. But now comes the hardest part. What's that? Stone asked, though he suspected he already knew. Now you must prove to them that her faith in you was justified. You must come with us to our camp tonight. You must stand before the elders who have spent their entire lives hating your people and convince them that one act of kindness can outweigh generations of bloodshed. Red Thunder gestured toward his horse. Are you ready to bet your life on the word of a child? Stone looked down at Morning Dove, who was watching him with those same desperate eyes that had started this whole ordeal. But this time he realized she wasn't begging for his help. She was offering hers, and somehow that made all the difference. I'm ready, Stone said. The ride to the Apache camp took 3 hours through terrain Stone had never seen before. Hidden canyons and secret paths that no white man had ever traveled. The warriors rode in perfect formation around him, and while they were no longer pointing weapons at him, he could feel their watchful presence like a physical weight. Morning Dove rode with her father, but she kept turning back to look at Stone as if reassuring herself that he was still there, or perhaps reassuring him that she hadn't forgotten what he'd done for her. As they approached the camp, Stone could see dozens of fires flickering in the darkness and hear the low murmur of voices as word spread of their arrival. Women and children emerged from wickiups to stare at the unprecedented sight, a white man riding into their camp as something other than a prisoner. The tribal council convened immediately despite the late hour. 7 elders sat in a semicircle around a central fire, their weathered faces grave in the dancing shadows. Stone was directed to stand in the center, acutely aware that he was probably the first white man to enter this sacred space and live to tell about it. Red Thunder spoke first, explaining in Apache the circumstances of his daughter's rescue. His voice was measured, careful, presenting facts without emotion. Then came Swift Eagle, who, despite his earlier change of heart, still argued for traditional justice. He spoke of his brother killed by white soldiers 2 summers ago, of children starving on the reservation, of promises broken and treaties torn apart. The debate went back and forth in Apache for what felt like hours, with Stone understanding nothing except the occasional gesture in his direction. He stood there, feeling the weight of history pressing down on him, All the violence, all the misunderstandings, all the fear and hatred that had brought them to this moment. Finally, Mourning Dove stepped forward again. This time her voice was calm and measured, but her words carried the weight of absolute conviction. She spoke for nearly 10 minutes, never once looking away from the elders' faces. Stone watched as skepticism gradually gave way to something else in those ancient eyes. Perhaps surprise that one so young could speak with such wisdom or recognition of truth that transcended age. When she finished, the oldest member of the council, an ancient man whose hair was white as desert bones, asked her a single question. Her answer was immediate and unwavering, delivered with a lift of her chin that spoke of certainty beyond her years. Red Thunder turned to Stone. Grey Wolf asked her if she truly believes you would risk your life to save an Apache child again, knowing what it might cost you. She said yes without hesitation. The elders conferred among themselves in whispers that sounded like wind through dry leaves. Stone's heart pounded as he waited for their decision, knowing that these next few moments would determine whether he lived or died. But more than that, they would determine whether the cycle of violence between their peoples would continue or finally, perhaps, begin to break. Grey Wolf stood slowly, his joints creaking with age, supported by a staff carved with symbols Stone couldn't read. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of decades of wisdom, of countless councils of decisions that had shaped the fate of his people. He says, Red Thunder translated, that the spirits have sent us a test tonight, not a test of our ability to make war, but our ability to recognize when mercy deserves mercy in return. Stone felt his knees go weak with relief, but Grey Wolf wasn't finished. The old man continued speaking, his words flowing like water over Stone, measured and inevitable. You will be granted safe passage back to your land, Red Thunder continued translating. But more than that, you will be granted the protection of our tribe. Any Apache who harms you or your property will answer to this council. Stone could barely speak past the tightness in his throat. I don't know what to say. There is one condition, Grey Wolf continued through Red Thunder's translation. You must promise that if any of our people come to you in need, hungry, wounded, or lost, you will show them the same kindness you showed this child. I promise, Stone said without hesitation. On my life and on the memory of my own family, I swear it. What happened next surprised everyone, including Red Thunder. Mourning Dove ran to Stone and hugged him tightly around the waist, speaking in broken English for the first time. Thank you for saving me, she said haltingly. Now I save you. The council members rose as one, and Stone realized the ceremony was ending. But as they prepared to leave the circle, Grey Wolf approached him directly, moving with surprising grace despite his age. The old man placed a weathered hand on Stone's shoulder and spoke directly to him in Apache. Though Stone couldn't understand the words, he could feel their weight, their importance. He is giving you a name, Red Thunder explained, and Stone could hear something like wonder in the chief's voice. In our tongue, you will be known as Water Bearer, one who gives life in the desert. It is a sacred name, one that carries great honor. As dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Stone rode back to his ranch with an escort of honor instead of a war party. 20 warriors accompanied him not as threats, but as protectors, ensuring his safe return to his land. Mourning Dove rode beside him on a small pinto pony, chattering happily in a mixture of Apache and her newly discovered English words. When they reached his property, Stone was surprised to find Ezra Blackwood, Deputy Hutchins, and Reverend Mills waiting by his cabin. The three men's faces went white as ash when they saw the Apache escort, and Blackwood actually reached for his rifle before thinking better of it. Josiah, Reverend Mills said weakly, we were certain you were dead. Came to see about burying you proper." Blackwood added his usual bluster, completely absent. "Maybe saying some words over your grave." Stone dismounted and helped Mourning Dove down from her pony. "As you can see, gentlemen, reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated." Red Thunder rode forward, his presence immediately commanding attention from the three settlers. When he spoke, his English was perfect and pointed. "This man is under the protection of the Apache Nation. Any harm that comes to him or his property will be considered an act of war against my people. Make sure this is known in your settlement." Blackwood's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. But he... How did... "He showed mercy to my daughter when she was dying," Red Thunder said simply. "He gave water to the thirsty and food to the hungry. He risked his life for a child not of his people. These are the actions of a true human being." The chief turned his horse and prepared to leave, but Mourning Dove tugged on his sleeve. After a brief conversation in Apache, Red Thunder nodded and turned back to Stone. "My daughter wishes to know if she may visit you again. She says she would like to learn more of your language and perhaps teach you some of ours." Stone knelt down to Mourning Dove's level. "You'll always be welcome at my well, little one. Always." And so it began. What started as one act of mercy rippled outward like circles in a pond. Stone's ranch became neutral ground, a place where Apache and settlers could meet without fear. Mourning Dove visited regularly, becoming fluent in English with the rapid ease of childhood, while Stone slowly learned Apache words and customs. Other children began to accompany her, Apache children curious about the white man who had saved their chief's daughter, settler children drawn by stories of the exotic visitors. Stone found himself running an impromptu school, teaching letters and numbers while learning traditional songs and stories in return. Reverend Mills, after recovering from his initial shock, began holding joint services where Apache spiritual leaders and Christian ministers spoke of their shared values: mercy, justice, protection of the innocent. The services were awkward at first, full of misunderstandings and mistranslations, but gradually they became something beautiful, a bridge between worlds. Even Ezra Blackwood, stubborn as a mule and twice as ornery, eventually came around. When his cattle were scattered by a flash flood, it was Apache warriors who helped him round them up. When Swift Eagle's son broke his leg falling from a horse, it was Blackwood who rode 40 miles to fetch the settlement doctor. The treaty that followed wasn't signed in some far-off government building by men who'd never set foot in the desert. It was negotiated at Stone's well with water drawn from the earth, serving as a reminder of what had started it all. Both sides made compromises, both sides made sacrifices, but the peace held because it was built on something stronger than paper and promises. It was built on the understanding that enemies could choose to see each other as human beings. Stone lived to be 73. His hair, white as gray wolf's, had been his face carved by decades of desert sun and wind. He never remarried, never had other children, but his life was far from lonely. The Apache named him Water Bearer, but the settlers came to call him something else, the Peacekeeper. On the day he died, his cabin was surrounded by mourners from both cultures. Apache warriors sang death songs while Christian hymns rose to meet them. Mourning Dove, now a grandmother herself and one of the territory's most respected translators and mediators, held his hand as he passed. They buried him near his well, and on his gravestone they carved words in both English and Apache. "Here lies Josiah Stone, who gave water to the thirsty and proved that mercy is the strongest force in the desert." Every year on the anniversary of that fateful night, people gathered at Stone's well, Apache and settlers, old enemies, now friends, sharing water and stories. Children who had never known the hatred of the past played together while their parents remembered and gave thanks. And mourning dove, her hair now streaked with silver, but her spirit still strong, would tell the story again. How a starving child found more than water at a stranger's well. How a lonely rancher found purpose in an act of kindness. How 200 warriors rode out for vengeance and discovered justice instead. The well still stands today, though the cabin has long since crumbled back into the earth. Local legends say that on quiet nights you can still hear the echo of drums in the distance. Not war drums, but celebration drums, marking the moment when the desert learned that water freely given can heal wounds that weapons never could. Because sometimes in the harsh landscape of the American frontier, where survival often meant choosing your own life over another's, the greatest courage was found in the simplest acts. The courage to see shared humanity across the divide of culture and conflict. The courage to offer water to a thirsty child, even when that child might be your enemy. The courage to choose mercy over fear, and in doing so, change the course of history one small act at a time.